Great, thank you. Welcome to today's Brown Bag Seminar Series, hosted by the Delta Stewardship Council Delta Science Program, along with today's seminar partners. Our partners today are the Delta Protection Commission, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Office of Spill Prevention and Response, and Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program. Please silence your cell phones, and if you need to use the bathroom, please take a key from the wall, exit the doors, and go to the left. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Annie Daly is a master's candidate at the UC Santa Barbara Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. She grew up in Stockton, where she originally became familiar with the Delta. She received her bachelor's in environmental studies from Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. After graduation, she worked in the Bay Area in environmental consulting for 5 years with a company that primarily focused on NEPA compliance. She went back to get her master's at UC Santa Barbara's Bren School, where she is pursuing a Master's of Environmental Science and Management with an emphasis in coastal and marine resource management. She's doing her thesis on the recovery of the hake fishery in Chile. This summer, she did an internship with the Office of Spill Prevention and Response, and today she will talk about the work from her internship exploring the abandoned vessels in the Delta. Please join me in welcoming Annie Daly. I'm going to take a quick side moment to make sure that the people online can hear with our new microphone. Sorry about that. Great.
Thank you, Mir. Wave at me if you can't hear me at any point during this. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction. As Mir said, I'm interning with the Office of Spill Prevention and Response, which is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's oil spill response arm, and that work is supported by the Delta Protection Commission, who's supporting my internship this summer. And the Delta Protection Commission has an interest in recreation and safe navigation in the Delta, so that's kind of how they play into this. So, as Nir said, I'm going to talk about the issues of abandoned and derelict vessels in the Delta today. So a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to go over the background, what is an abandoned vessel, why they're a problem, the current program that exists in California addressing this issue, the Office of Spill Prevention and Response's work in this area, and then we're going to talk about looking forward next steps. So the first thing to address is what is an abandoned derelict vessel? And the definition varies by state. In California, there's no definition for derelict, but in general, it can kind of mean vessels that is dilapidated, unseaworthy, sinking, can no longer be used for its intended purpose, or that disposal would cost more than the worth of the vessel. California does have a definition for abandoned, which is from the Harbors and Navigation Code, and it's up here. So any hulk, derelict, wreck, or part of any ship, vessel, or other watercraft sunk, beached, or allowed to remain in an unseaworthy condition for a period of longer than 30 days. So I have some examples up here, but you might ask, why would someone abandon their vessel? And there's a lot of possible reasons, but disposal can be expensive, and people maybe buy boats and don't realize how expensive they are. It's possible to buy unseaworthy vessels very cheap and to maybe think you're going to redo them for a fun project and not realize how expensive that is. People can also be one medical bill or accident away from not being able to afford having a boat anymore. People might also abandon their vessels because it's kind of easy to do. The fines for abandoning your vessel are $1,000 plus the cost of removal, but those can be avoided if you can't be tracked down. Not to give anyone ideas. But many people do dispose of their vessels responsibly. A lot of people also know that you shouldn't be abandoning your vessel, so some people do scrape the CF number off of their vessel before abandoning it to try to avoid the consequences. So why are abandoned vessels a problem? Well, they can pose navigational hazards, they can leach chemicals and leak oil into the natural environment, they can contain hazardous materials or radioactive materials on board, they create public health and safety risks, and they can damage sensitive environments both through the release of pollution and by physically upsetting habitats or dragging along seabeds. And as many of you already know, the Delta is a very special place. It's home to more than 750 species of animals and plants, 100 of which are special status species. It's also the largest estuary on the west coast of North America. Hundreds of millions of dollars of agriculture come out of the Delta, and it's an important recreation destination. So understandably, reducing the amount of pollution that's in the Delta and eliminating obstacles to navigation and recreation is something that's important to a lot of us. And while my presentation is going to focus on vessels in the Delta, this is a problem that exists statewide. And the Delta is the epicenter, but it's an issue everywhere. So just a little over a month ago, we saw a vessel in the news that really did a great job of illustrating the complexity of this issue. And that vessel is the Point Estero, which is pictured here. And it's a commercial fishing vessel that ran aground near the Estero Bluffs State Park at the end of July. And the vessel wasn't severely damaged, but it did get stuck on the rocks, and emergency personnel monitored the vessel for leaks and removed fuel and hazardous material and tried to refloat the vessel, which was not successful. The cost of removing the vessel was estimated to be about $170,000, and the vessel owner couldn't afford that and didn't have insurance. So you might wonder, how does the state deal with this kind of problem? Is there a program in place to deal with vessels when owners can't be found or owners can't afford to remove a vessel? And so to answer that question, there's a network of federal, state, and local agencies that all work on this problem, and different agencies have the authority to address different issues or different parts of the problem. So one second. So for example, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, responds to vessels when a vessel is within or threatening a marine sanctuary. The Army Corps of Engineers gets involved when an abandoned vessel sinks or impacts a navigable channel. The Coast Guard oversees the federal response efforts for the containment, removal, disposal of oil or hazardous substances released into marine environments. California State Lands Commission has the authority to remove abandoned vessels, but does not necessarily have funding to do that. The Office of Spill Prevention and Response, OSPR, who I'm interning with, is the pollution response arm of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so they're the state's lead for response to oil spills in marine and inland waters, and OSPR wardens respond to oil spills often. Counties, often the sheriff's offices, do the actual removal of the vessels or will contract out with private companies to remove a vessel. And the Division of Boating and Waterways runs a reimbursement program that helps counties pay for the removal of vessels. So if that sounds confusing and complicated, it's because it is. There's a bunch of agencies that deal with this problem and no overarching program or funding source. So when an abandoned vessel is found, contact with the owner is often attempted, and if the owner is located, he or she is responsible for the removal costs. However, as mentioned before, there's lots of reasons people abandon their vessels, and people aren't always able to be located and aren't always able to afford removal. Oh, no, 1 second. Also, as I said before, often the CF number is removed, and that can really impede tracking down the owner. So while it seems like you might say, oh, there's a boat and it's abandoned and the owner should pay for its removal and deal with that, it's not actually that easy to solve. So I want to talk a little bit more about the Division of Boating and Waterways program. So this is the state's official abandoned vessel removal program. It's the Surrendered and Abandoned Vessel Exchange Program, or the SAVE program, and it provides grants for local public agencies to pay for the removal of vessels, and the grants are awarded annually and can be used for the removal of recreational vessels only. There is no removal program that applies to all vessels overall or that exists for commercial vessels. And SAVE is made up of two kind of sub-efforts. There's the Abandoned Watercraft Abatement Fund, AWAF, and then there's the Vessel Turn-In Program, or VTIP. So AWAF is a reimbursement grant program that provides funds for the abatement, storage, removal, and disposal of abandoned vessels, and VTIP is a program that, my bad, guys, is a program that allows boat owners to turn in their vessel to a public agency for free disposal. And VTIP's pretty successful, and it's an important program because it seeks to prevent spills and prevent boats from being abandoned in the first place, and that's particularly important because it costs the state so much less to pay for a vessel, to dispose of a vessel that's brought to them before it's abandoned, than to pay for the disposal after a vessel is abandoned and maybe sinks or releases hazardous material into the environment. So something that's important to note is the Division of Boating and Waterways program makes a clear distinction between recreational and commercial vessels. So commercial vessels, that includes things like commercial fishing ships, shrimp trawlers, barges, and tugs, and recreational vessels include things like paddle boats, houseboats, sailboats, ski boats. And so SAVE covers the removal of recreational vessels, and this program is funded by several sources, including recreational registration fees, fuel taxes, money from SB1, and the entire SAVE budget tends to be between $1 and $3 million a year. The removal of commercial vessels is often much more expensive because commercial vessels are larger and heavier usually, and that sometimes can require different equipment for removal. And so to kind of put this in perspective, the Spirit of Sacramento, which was about an 85-foot paddle wheel river boat that capsized near Bethel Island recently, it cost almost $2 million to remove. And so you can kind of see if removing a commercial vessel like that was to be paid for by the SAVE program, it would blow the entire state's budget for the entire year. Something else to note is that while recreational vessels register with the DMV and therefore there's a mechanism exists to kind of for the state to get funding from recreational vessels, commercial vessels don't register for the state, and so it's difficult to get them to pay into some kind of account that will pay for commercial vessel removal. So this is a significant gap in the state's abandoned vessel program, and even with the recreational program in place, removal of recreational vessels is challenging. A lot of counties have more abandoned vessels than they have money to put into their removal, and while VTIP seems to be a very successful program, I spoke with a lot of counties that don't have enough VTIP money to dispose of the vessels that people bring to them. So as one harbor master I spoke with said, you know, when you turn people away who come to bring you vessels through VTIP, you hope that they do the right thing, but you don't really know where those vessels are going to end up. And this brings us to the Office of Spill Prevention and Response's work. So as I said before, Office of Spill Prevention and Response is the pollution response arm of California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And because OSPR deals with oil spills and because OSPR wardens deal with abandoned vessels on nearly a daily basis, this is a problem that's of particular interest to them. And so OSPR is working to kind of better understand this problem in order to work towards developing solutions. And I'm working this summer with OSPR staff members on a few projects that are aimed at gathering more information on abandoned vessels. And so some of our projects are listed up here, and I'm going to go into them in a second. So the first question OSPR's been looking to answer is, where are these vessels? And OSPR is seeking to answer that question through aerial surveys and on-the-water surveys. Last spring, OSPR did an aerial survey in order to create an inventory and track the vessels that exist in the Delta. And inventorying these vessels is important because if we can track the vessels and if we can kind of have an idea of what's out there, we can distinguish between legacy vessels and new arrivals, and we can also look at patterns of abandonment, figure out if there's hot spots, see if vessels show up during certain times of the year, that kind of thing. So Here's some of the results from the aerial survey. Every dot on this map represents anywhere from 1 to 12 vessels that was located during the survey. The survey was completed during 10 different flights, and those flights are indicated with different color dots. And the survey was conducted by one of the OSPR wardens, Mitch Good, and so this is his data. So the black line indicates the flight path, and the color is not really significant for this map. And this map is just a different iteration of the previous map, but it shows you for each of those dots that, for each of the vessels, it differentiates between commercial or recreational and also points out whether the vessel was floating, sunk, or on land. So the circles are commercial vessels, the triangles are recreational, and you can see a lot of the vessels are floating recreational vessels, those yellow triangles. And so it's kind of difficult to see, but I have some graphics that I'm going to show you that breaks down this information further. And then as kind of a disclaimer, because each point on the map represented 1 to 12 vessels, there's kind of a range of possible vessels that we came up with when we went through the data. So this is a very rough estimate, and this is the low range of the possible full number of vessels in the Delta. So as you can see, about 20% of the vessels were commercial and about 80% were found to be recreational. This further breaks down the vessels by whether they were sunk, floating, partially submerged, or upside down. And then this graph shows the distribution of vessels across the 5 counties that were in the survey area. As you can see, Solano County has the most vessels, and Yolo County has the fewest at 17. And these graphs show the proportion of commercial and recreational vessels within each of those counties. So similar to the first pie chart we looked at, every county has about 20% commercial vessels and 80 recreational, except San Joaquin County, which has a much larger proportion of commercial vessels. And lastly, this graph shows the same information that we just saw, but all kind of in one place. So OSPR also conducted a water survey, which occurred last week, and the goal of that was to ground truth the data that was collected from the aerial survey. And we haven't had a chance to process that data yet because it was only a few days ago. But from what we saw, it did seem like the points that were seen from the air were pretty accurate. And this is one of the pictures we took during the On the Water survey. And what I like about this picture is that it shows how valuable an air survey is. A lot of the vessels seem to be maybe nestled back in channels or hidden in the reeds, and those areas are hard to reach by boat. So conducting the water survey reinforced or illustrated the importance of doing an air survey because there's so many vessels that really can't be seen from the water. So because the aerial survey provided us with coordinates of the ADV, abandoned derelict vessel, coordinates of the vessels in the Delta, we were able to go through Google Earth and look through the historical imagery and see how long these vessels have been in the Delta. So using the aerial survey data, I went through and found all of the commercial vessels and tracked each of them back in time. We found that the oldest vessel can be tracked back to 1939, which is the last year that a clear image exists on Google Earth for that area. 24 of the vessels, of the 52 vessels, have been in place since year 2000, and in the last 10 years, between 1 and 5 of the commercial vessels that were observed in the aerial survey arrived each year. So again, this is a very, very rough average guess, but looking at the vessels in our survey, it seemed that there was about an average arrival rate of 2 commercial vessels a year in the Delta. And it's not super surprising considering there's not a ton of funding available or a program for the removal of commercial vessels, so it's not really surprising that once they show up in the Delta, they seem to kind of stay there. Something else we're able to see by looking at historical imagery was when vessels sank. And so this is a vessel that was seen during the aerial survey and is out by Bethel Island. And this image is from August 2012. And just for fun, we'll look at some of the pictures as time passes. So this is the same vessel from June 2013. This is August 2014, August 2015, and March 2017. So that same vessel, you can barely see it in this picture. And so even though removal is challenging and funding really doesn't exist necessarily for commercial vessel removal, it's frustrating to see vessels sinking because that increases the cost of the vessel removal by several magnitudes. So using the aerial and eventually the water survey data, I'm creating an estimate of the cost of removing all the vessels from the Delta. And this work isn't quite done yet, but I'll be wrapping it up in the next couple weeks. The factors that influence the cost of removal, some of them are listed up here. So just to give you an idea that it can be, the removal costs can vary widely based on these factors. But based on a very rough look at the data that we have so far, the cost for removal for the 52 vessels found during the aerial survey, the 52 commercial vessels, is likely to be about over $15 million and maybe much more than that. So another thing that we're doing at OSPRA this summer is looking at abandoned derelict vessel programs in other states to see if anyone's using an idea that could be applied in California. And we're able to do this because this isn't just a problem in California. All coastal states really seem to be struggling with the same problem. And so NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration has a marine debris info hub, which is pictured here. And it's a pretty cool resource that shows information about ADV programs across the country and shows whether each state has a program, legislation, or funding that supports abandoned vessel removal. And so this summer, I interviewed coordinators from Washington, Texas, Florida, Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Oregon. And the purpose was to see if anyone's doing anything that could be applied here. And my takeaway was that all states, except Maryland, who's doing great, all the states have huge challenges dealing with ADVs, and limited funding seems to be an issue for all of these states. All of the states also seem to really struggle with dealing with commercial vessels. And while most of the states do have programs that cover both vessel types, commercial and recreational, most of the states don't actually focus on commercial vessel removal because it's cost prohibitive. So the other things up here that I haven't mentioned yet, a lot of states also have methods for tracking vessels. A lot of states are piloting vessel turn-in programs like the one California has. And only one program places a fee on commercial vessels to pay for vessel removal. And so the program that does that is Washington State's program, and they're really leading the pack as far as abandoned derelict vessel programs go. They have several rules in place that are aimed at reducing the inflow of vessels that are abandoned in their waters. So some of the things that they do is they require marinas to require the vessels in those marinas to have insurance that will cover removal if the vessel sinks. They have a secondary liability law, which requires people who want to sell old and large vessels to get that vessel evaluated for seaworthiness before selling it. They also require people who are buying old and large vessels to have insurance for at least 1 year after the purchase is made. And they are also the only state that I found that keeps track of commercial vessels on a state level and also charges commercial vessels a fee that goes into a removal fund. And so they charge commercial vessels a $1 per foot fee that goes towards removal efforts. So Washington has a lot of good ideas. And however, aside from Washington, all the coastal states are really struggling with this issue and with commercial vessels in particular. So as I mentioned, a lot of states had tracking mechanisms, which is something else that I'm looking into this summer, because California doesn't really have a statewide tracking platform for tracking abandoned vessels. A lot of the counties and sheriff's offices do have a very good idea of the abandoned vessels that are in their area, but there isn't really a comprehensive statewide mechanism. So here's some examples that other states are using. The bottom right corner is South Carolina's My Coast app. So they use an app that is given to the public, and it allows the public to report abandoned vessels to the state government. The image above My Coast is from Florida. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has a derelict vessel map, and when the officers find a vessel and start opening the abandoned vessel report, they enter the vessel into this map, color code it based on whether or not it's a navigational hazard, and then after the vessel is removed, they remove it from the map. The image on the left is NOAA's Environmental Response Management application. So that allows federal and state agencies to track abandoned vessels, but doesn't have a way for local agencies to add vessels into their database. So these could be some good things for California to explore. And so now that we've talked a little bit about the state's ADV issues in depth, I wanted to circle back to the Point Estero and kind of look at what happened. So the last thing that we talked about was that the Point Estero ran aground and that the owner couldn't pay for removal. So what happened next? Well, the Coast Guard and OSPR oversaw the removal of oil and hazardous materials from the boat, since, as we discussed, those are the agencies responsible for pollution prevention and the disposal of hazardous materials and oil. The vessel is aground off the coast of the Esteros Bluffs State Beach, but the vessel is not technically on state parks land because it's below the ordinary high water line. And that means that the boat is on land that belongs to the State Lands Commission. So while the State Lands Commission has the authority to remove the vessel, they don't have any funding to do the removal. The vessel is in San Luis Obispo County, so the county could remove it, but if SLO County does decide to remove it, they can't apply for SAVE funding because this is a commercial vessel, not a recreational vessel. So they can't be reimbursed through SAVE. So the removal cost was estimated at about $170,000, and as of September 1st, which is when I called the park to ask if the boat was still there, the boat is still there, and they haven't heard anything as far as plans for its removal. And so I wanted to bring up this vessel because it really illustrates the complications that arise that are related to kind of the patchwork of authority and funding that exists when it comes to abandoned vessel removal in California. And so abandoned vessels are a significant problem in California, and California has the 4th largest number of registered boaters in the country. And so it's unlikely, or the problem isn't likely to go away unless changes are made. And so OSPR and other state agencies are looking for solutions to the problem and exploring ways to address these gaps that exist in authority and funding when it comes to vessel removal. So using the information that's being gathered from the aerial and on-water surveys, using the results of the cost estimate, learning from successes and challenges other states are facing, and improving our ability to track vessels will hopefully help OSPR and other state agencies to understand the problem better and develop solutions to this complicated issue. And that's all I got. Any questions? Yes. Oh, you need the mic.
We got one that works.
My name is Barbara Daly. I'm with a group called North Delta Cares. It's in the heart of the Delta. And I wonder if someone doesn't want their boat anymore and perhaps it's not salvageable and no one would want to buy it, where can they take that boat so they don't have to abandon it?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So that's exactly what the VTIP program is there for. So I guess they should contact maybe their marina or the sheriff's office because there's probably a VTIP program that's being run somewhere in their area. It varies by county, so I'm not really sure who specifically would be the person to look into ask, but definitely look for a VTIP program. Yeah. That's a good question. So, oh, yeah, I'll repeat your question. You're asking if people know that there's like a vessel turn-in program, that's an option instead of abandoning their boat. I don't know. That's a great question. I called a lot of marinas and sheriff's offices over the summer to kind of get more information about their experiences, and I asked all of them if they were doing outreach or prevention, and a lot of them did say that they like have a newsletter or post on their Facebook or bring it up during like the marina Christmas party. So the marinas would say that they are doing things, but I'm not sure how effective the outreach is. Definitely opportunities for better outreach.
Hi, I enjoyed your talk. I was wondering, so when you're doing the aerial surveys, or I guess even on the water surveys, and you see a recreational boat, how do you determine that it is in fact abandoned and just not sitting there for an extended period of time and being occasionally used?
Yeah. It's a good question. Well, as far as the aerial survey goes, that's a lot more difficult. For the aerial survey, we used a ton of assumptions, and for all we know, when the vessel was like logged into as the GPS waypoint, maybe it was a vessel that wasn't abandoned and just kind of looked run down from the air. I think, yeah, that is tricky. I think a lot of it's probably done on site. Like, that looks run down, that looks not loved, but there are, you can like post notices and kind of say like, we suspect this might be abandoned. You have 30 days. If this isn't abandoned, please call this number. So there's things like that that can be done to, yeah, find that out. Thanks for your question.
I may have missed this, but when you were doing the aerial survey, were you noting boats that had actually been sunk as well, or was it just, so how was that determined? Could you repeat that again?
Yeah, so I wasn't on the aerial survey, but the warden who was on the survey did seem to be able to tell, like identify sunk vessels from the air. You can still kind of see, an outline in a lot of cases. Sorry, what was the second half of your question?
Well, I was just curious if there was what technique was being done to identify them under the water. And do you think that they were identifying all of them, like it was like some kind of a radar approach, or do you think that there could have been others under there that weren't identified?
Yeah, I think there definitely could have been others that weren't identified. They were just they weren't using a radar or anything. I just wanted to go back to this picture. They weren't using a radar. They just were in a plane and had like a GPS receiver unit and were pushing it every time they saw a button. And then one of the wardens took handwritten notes, just like big fishing boat sunk. So not super high tech. Also, as you can see in this map, the flight path is kind of crazy. Like there's a ton of loops. So I think it's very possible that vessels were missed. So while the graphs were made using a low estimate of the data that was collected, I think that's even a low estimate as far as what exists in the Delta overall. You're welcome.
thanks. I enjoyed your talk a lot. And I like that you're looking at all the costs to identify what might be possible in terms of removing them. Are you also thinking about potential benefits of removal? Because I'm sure some ships, it would be really good, you know, they're in sensitive habitat or they have a lot of oil or something.
Yeah, so I'm a summer intern, so my time is coming to a close, but that was definitely on my list of things I thought would be really interesting to explore, and I'm not going to have time to do that, but I'm not really sure if someone else who's picking up the work after I leave might be doing something like that, because, yeah, I agree, that'd be very interesting to see. Thank you.
Hi. In your research, when you were looking at legislation in different states, did you come across, when looking specifically for kind of how California set up its laws, why some of these, why this patchwork exists? Did you come across any like efforts for legislation that failed, or why they failed, things like that?
Yes. So, not entirely. I have a half answer, but also we have an expert in the crowd who might know more than I do. There was a legislative effort that happened in 2016. It was through Representative Frazier's office, and there was so he tried to add commercial vessels into the SAVE program. In the law, it just says like that the funding can only be used for recreational vessels. So it was really just adding, you know, a sentence or two, and that did not succeed. Kind of maybe understandably from this presentation, I think the feeling was that recreational boaters maybe felt it was unfair that money that comes from their registration fees would go to removal of commercial vessels, and also there's such a big cost difference when it comes to removal. But as far as why why a patchwork exists in the first place, I don't know, and I don't know if anyone out here knows. I don't know if you know, but
I don't want to rain on your parade. You're doing it.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
I was wondering, back to the question about cost, it looked like a big issue for a lot of these entities was the funding to remove the vessels, and I was wondering if you know if there are any programs to salvage any of the metals or anything that might still be valuable on these boats to help cover the costs.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So some of the steel can be salvaged and can kind of offset the cost of removal. And something that was really interesting was when I was talking to Texas's abandoned vessel coordinator or removal coordinator, he had said that for a while they had a salvager go like along the coastline and remove all the abandoned vessels for free because the steel market was really strong and they're able to offset their costs and make a little money. And when I asked him, like, oh, is that do you think that would work again? He said, like, no, the steel market's not doing so well, I guess. But yeah, so there are some costs that can be recovered.
So I know this is sometimes a big thing in areas off the coast where they do abandon ships and also oil platforms that become essential habitat for species. Is anybody looking at the potential for that in the Delta of species utilizing these abandoned ships, or is it kind of on a time scale that's too short?
That's a good question. I don't know of anyone looking into that. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I think I missed it earlier. You said is there a way to report any of these abandoned vessels that have been seen out in the Delta? Since you said there's like 2 every year, that means there's a constant influx. I mean, it's not very high, but that's actually good. But how would you report that? There are a lot of surveys out there using high-frequency sonar underwater, also looking at a lot of the edges within the Delta. I'm not sure about more further west, but in the Delta there are a lot of those that could pick up a lot of these potential vessels that have sunk or no longer part of the aerial surveys.
Yeah, if you found a vessel you wanted to report, you could probably call your county sheriff's office. It sounds like they do get people reporting vessels that way. They also maybe already know about the vessel. But it's my hope that eventually maybe there is a way for public to report, maybe online or using an app, something like South Carolina does, and to kind of funnel that into an inventory, but nothing really exists like that right now.
I can't figure out, as a former boater, why this isn't approached before everything happens, with insurance, requiring insurance just like you driving your car.
Yeah.
Okay. And it seems like you shouldn't be able to even put a boat in a marina in the Delta without the proper insurance. And also it's an education. What's really needed is an education program to tell people the differences between insurance, just like car insurance. You can buy cheap car insurance that'll only cover the very, very minimum. And boaters tend to get the cheapest insurance sometime that isn't covering an oil spill or whatever happens, even in the marina. And you'll find there's a great difference in marinas in the Delta. I live across the street from Village West Marina that's, I think, probably got the highest standards of any marina in the Delta now. And they're setting new standards. And that's what has to be done. So, and Boat USA, I wrote a lot of articles for Boat USA magazine. And like some magazines won't say anything negative about boating, and that's why I like writing for Boat US, because it's owned by an insurance company, and they want to tell the difference or educate people about accidents and things like this. Here you go.
Yeah, I agree. It's like an insurance requirement would be a really good thing.
Did a nice job in your presentation. Most of it directed to identification of the problem. The next chapter on solutions and assignment of responsibilities certainly needs to be written. I had a couple observations. On any of our environmental problems where we have a mix of regulatory agencies, that is the birthright of finger-pointing across agencies. And the budget that you've spoken to and budgetary issues are real, but they really come down to prioritization within the agencies. And a lot of agencies have substantial flexibility in their budgets, and then others, Fish and Game would be one, that less so. But we've run into this probably in other places, but pesticide container abandonment, huge problem. Similar federal, state, 26 different agencies, and nothing happened until the governor's office coordinated with the federal folks at EPA, and all the agencies came together, and responsibility was divided up, so each one knew specifically, their not just their jurisdiction, but what slice of the pie they were going to have. Because if we don't get at that, and now some we need legislation. Dealing with the commercial need legislation. But there's an awful lot we could do in the private CF boats right away. But it needs to be turned into an action program, not just an evaluation.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of room for improvement.
I'd like to follow up on that in that with the limited monies that are available, what is the prioritization process for how they determine what they're going to, which boats they're going to you know, salvage and which ones they're not, et cetera? Or have you heard of any prioritization processes? Yeah, so it's up to each county or marina that gets the grant to determine how they want to use that funding. So I think it varies a lot, but I feel like it's safe to say the ones that are prioritized are probably ones that impact navigation, that are maybe leaking oil, or ones that are maybe in danger of sinking but haven't sunk yet. I'd assume those would be on the higher priority list. And a lot of the states that I looked into have more formal prioritization kind of structures for how they award funding for vessels. Like Washington has a 4-tiered prioritization system, but California is not really like that.
Not to give you another assignment, but I'm hoping your information, I think it's great you're gathering this info. I hope it's forwarded to all the legislators from all these counties that surround the Delta. There's a lot of political power in Contra Costa, Sacramento, San Joaquin, and Solano, and I'm not sure the various legislators know that this is an issue, so I hope you guys do a nice job of putting it together and making sure they're aware this is a big problem, and perhaps they can work together, form a task force, something along those lines, to then take that back to the Capitol and push for legislation that way.
Yeah, that would be great. And kind of the nice thing about, I don't have control of the PowerPoint anymore, but kind of the nice thing about seeing the breakdown by county, and we also have a breakdown by legislative districts, is to kind of see which politicians might have special interest in addressing this issue. Oh, thank you. You're welcome.
Are there any more questions? Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.